Chapter 3 Red Sons of Israel. Western New York regarded its Indian mounds with a curiosity that made an amateur antiquarian of almost everyone in the area. What had caused the giant heaps of skeletons nobody seemed to know, but nobody lacked the theory. The Palmyra newspaper showed a continuing interest in the mystery, one editor writing in 1818 that the luckless inhabitants were doubtless killed in battle and hastily buried, and another saying more humbly in 1823 that what wonderful catastrophe destroyed the first inhabitants is beyond the researches of the best scholar and greatest antiquarian. It was a common legend that western New York and Ohio had once been the site of a terrible slaughter, and that the mounds were the cemeteries of an entire race. New York's famous governor, DeWitt Clinton, fascinated by the antiquities of his state, had stopped by Canandaigua in 1811 to examine 3 mounds, and after counting the rings of the trees growing on their surfaces, had estimated their age at more than 1,000 years. The mound builders, he said, were unquestionably a lost race, which had once been vast in number and greatly superior in civilization to the Iroquois. There was universal admiration for the palisaded geometrical forts, the ruins of which were silhouetted against the sky atop the cone-like drumlins that dotted the landscape. Since the pottery and copper ornaments buried in the mounds were frequently beautiful in design and skillfully wrought, few believed they were the handiwork of the despised Red Man. The Palmyra Register in January 1818 pointed out that the mound builders had made such greater advances in the arts of civilized life than any Indians, and the Palmyra Herald in February 1823 insisted that the antiquities clearly proved them to be the work of some other people. The theory persisted for half a century that the mound builders were a race of peaceful farmers and metal workers who had been invaded and utterly exterminated by a bloodthirsty race that was ancestor to the modern Indian. William Henry Harrison, shortly before his election to the presidency, wrote that the last great battle took place on the banks of the Ohio, where a feeble band was collected, remnant of mighty battles fought in vain, to make a last effort for the country of their birth, the ashes of their ancestors and the altars of their gods. The mystery of the mound builders attracted no one more than Joseph Smith. According to his mother, he was spinning theories about them before he was 20. During our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of traveling, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life with them. Sometime between 1820 and 1827, it occurred to the youth that he might try to write a history of the mound builders, a book that would answer the questions of every farmer with a mound in his pasture. He would not be content with the cheap trickery of the conjurer Walters, with his fake record of Indian treasure, although he might perhaps pretend to have found an ancient document or metal engraving in his digging expeditions. Somewhere he had heard that a history of the Indians had been found in Canada at the base of a hollow tree, and a Palmyra paper in 1821 had reported that diggers on the Erie Canal had unearthed several brass plates along with skeletons and fragments of pottery. Perhaps Joseph speculated that since his own family took such pleasure in his stories, a greater public might do the same. The dream of somehow recouping the family fortune must have been with him since childhood, and his marriage had doubtless doubled his ambition. Alert to the intellectual currents of his period, though only the backwash swirled through his community, he saw in all the antiquarian speculation an unparalleled opportunity. The plan of Joseph's book was to come directly out of a popular theory concerning the mound builders. His Book of Mormon was basically the history of 2 warring races. One, a fair and delightsome people, farmers, stock raisers, temple builders, and workers in copper, iron, and steel. The other, a wild and ferocious and a bloodthirsty people full of idolatry and filthiness, feeding upon beasts of prey, dwelling in tents, and wandering about in the wilderness, with a short skin girded about their loins, and their heads shaven, and their skill in the bow and the scimitar and the axe. Actually, the mound builders had not been a lost race, but the direct ancestors of certain of the upper Mississippi Indian tribes. But at that time, only a few antiquarians knew that the Indians had made a practice of exhuming, collecting together, and reburying in mounds all the bones of the recently dead. Even after the coming of the white man, this ceremony, known as the Festival of the Dead, had been celebrated in the Mississippi Valley. The Indian forts, on the other hand, were the fairly recent handiwork of the Iroquois. The quiet research of genuine scholars lay, of course, in a different world from Joseph's. He therefore accepted the popular theory of a lost race in all its details, including the last great battle of extermination, which he decided might very well have been in his own neighborhood. There was a hill near his father's farm that looked as if it might have been an immense Indian mound, rising alone and mysterious out of the gently rolling landscape. From its summit he could see for miles in every direction, and it may have struck him as an admirable site for a gigantic defensive battle. What better place to discover a record of the lost people? About a year after Joseph's marriage, rumors spread through Palmyra that he had unearthed an extraordinary treasure from the big hill on the turnpike just outside Manchester. No two of Joseph's neighbors had the same version of the story. Peter Ingersoll, who claimed to be Joseph's confidant, had a savagely cynical account. One day Joseph had taken home some fine white sand tied up in his frock, and his family, seated around the dinner table, asked him what he was carrying. At that moment, he is said to have told Ingersoll, I happened to think of what I had heard about a story found in Canada called the Golden Bible, so I very gravely told them that it was the Golden Bible. To my surprise, they were credulous enough to believe what I said. Accordingly, I told them that I had received a commandment to let no one see it, for, says I, no man can see it with the naked eye and live. However, I offered to take out the book and show it to them, but they refused to see it, and left the room. Now, he concluded, I've got the damned fools fixed, and will carry out the fun. One thing, however, puzzled Ingersoll. Notwithstanding, he told me that he had no such book, and believed there never was any such book, yet he told me that he actually went to Willard Chase to get him to make a chest in which he might deposit his Golden Bible. But, as Chase would not do it, he made a box himself with clapboards and put it into a pillowcase, and allowed people only to lift it and feel of it through the case. Chase told a different tale. In June 1827, he said, the elder Smith told him that a spirit had informed young Joseph that a record engraved on golden plates lay buried near his home. But when he tried to get the plates, he found a toad guarding them, which changed into a man and struck him on the head. This, Chase said, had happened several years before. In September 1827, Joseph had confided in him that at last he was to be allowed to dig up the plates and translate their contents, but he needed a chest to house them and promised Chase a share in the book if he would build it. Suspicious of the whole story, Chase refused. A few days afterwards, he told one of my neighbors that he had not got any such book, nor never had such an one, but that he had told the story to deceive the damned fool, meaning me, to get him to make a chest. Very few friends realized that the discovery had religious significance. Joseph Caprone said that Joseph's father gave him no intimation at that time that the book was to be of a religious character, or that it had anything to do with revelation. He declared it to be a speculation, and as early as February 1831, the editor of the Palmyra Reflector insisted that when Joseph first claimed to have found the plates, no divine interposition had been dreamed of. To Joseph's family and a few intimates like Martin Harris, however, the finding of the golden plates had world-shattering significance. Harris was a prosperous farmer who had followed an erratic trail of religious enthusiasms, having been successfully a Quaker, a Universalist, and a Restorationist. In describing Joseph's discovery to a local preacher, he declared that an important epoch had arrived, that a great flood of light was about to burst on the world, and that the scene of divine manifestation was to be immediately around us. The Golden Bible, he said, would contain such disclosures as would settle all religious controversies and speedily bring on the glorious millennium. Harris told the editor of the Rochester Gem that Joseph Smith had been visited by the Spirit of the Almighty in a dream, and informed that in such a certain hill in that town, Manchester, was deposited a golden Bible containing an ancient record of divine origin. For a long time, Joseph was extremely reluctant to talk about the plates. When his brother Hiram begged him to tell him the story of their discovery before a church council in 1831, he replied that it was not intended to tell all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and also said that it was not expedient for him to relate these things. But when in 1838 he set about writing the official history of the beginnings of his church, he was generous with details. On the night of September 21st, 1823, he wrote, he was kneeling by his bed asking forgiveness for his sins when a light filled his shabby room and a personage appeared at his side standing in the air. He had on a loose robe of most exquisite whiteness. His hands were naked and his arms also, a little above the wrists, so also were his feet naked, as were his legs, a little above the ankles. His head and neck were also bare. His whole person was glorious beyond description, and his countenance truly like lightning. He called me by name, and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that his name was Moroni, that God had a work for me to do, and that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues, or that it should be both good and evil spoken of among all people. He said that there was a book deposited, written upon gold plates, giving an account of the former inhabitants of his continent, and the sources from whence they sprang. He also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it, as delivered by the Savior to the ancient inhabitants. Also that there were 2 stones in silver bows, and these stones, fastened to a breastplate, constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim, deposited with the plates, and the possession and use of these stones were what constituted seers in ancient or former times, and that God had prepared them for the purpose of translating the book. 3 times that night the Spirit appeared, as angels were wont to do, for, to be authentic, celestial truth must be thrice repeated. The next day Joseph went to work in the fields with his father, but, feeling faint, started home before the day was spent. He fell unconscious on the ground, when the angel once more appeared to him and told him to relate his visions to his father. This he said he did, and the elder smith assured him that they were truly of God. Joseph related that he had found the plates in a stone box along with a sword and breastplate, to which were fastened the magic Urim and Thummim. The plates were thin, he said, about 8 inches square, bound together with 3 huge rings, and covered with engraved characters. Greed so filled his heart when he first saw them that the angel forbade him to touch them until he should become sufficiently purified and instructed in the things of the kingdom. Once each year for 4 years he returned to the spot, and, finally, on September 21, 1827, he was permitted to carry the plates home. Of the 4-year period between 1823 and 1827, Joseph wrote nothing in his autobiography, though it can scarcely be said to have been in a time of penance and purification, since it coincided with his most intensive money-digging activities. Exactly how he described the discovery of the golden plates to his family one cannot be sure, but it is clear that much of the story that he later wrote in his autobiography was known to his family and friends as early as 1827. Although confusion persisted over certain details, the main outlines were the same in that year as a decade later. In 1831, Lucy Smith wrote to her brother a full description of the coming of the angel and the unearthing and translation of the record, concluding soberly, "I want you to think very seriously of these things, for they are the truths of the living God." Although Joseph divulged almost no details about the golden plates other than the visions, Lucy Smith bubbled over with gossip. Her story is a mine of rich anecdote, garrulous and amusing, and adds to the confusion and contradiction already manifested in other documents. Emma and Joseph, she wrote, brought home the plates on September 22, 1827. Joseph showed her the magic spectacles, which she described as 2 smooth 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glasses set in silver bows. With them was a breastplate, which he had kept wrapped in a muslin handkerchief. It was concave on one side and convex on the other, and extended from the neck downwards as far as the center of the stomach of a man of extraordinary size. The whole plate was worth at least $500. Lucy never saw the golden plates, for Joseph warned his family that it meant instant death to look at them, and frequently changed their hiding place, but she lived in a constant state of alarm lest they be stolen. Willard Chase hired a conjurer from 60 miles away to divine their whereabouts, and Joseph at once transferred them from under the family hearthstone to a place beneath the floor of a cooper's shop across the street. Chase's sister, who apparently was more accomplished than the conjurer, divined this hiding place by means of a greenstone, and that night the shop was raided, the floor ripped up, and the chest demolished. But Joseph calmly informed his family that he had taken out the record the evening before, re-nailed the empty box, and replaced it beneath the floor. The plates were safe beneath a pile of flax in the shop. To Lucy's naive anecdotes, Joseph's converts added in later years stories of their own, and the many legends embellishing the discovery of the golden plates became as real to the Mormons as Joseph's own account of the angel. By 1856, Heber C. Kimball was describing before congregations in Great Salt Lake City a vast cave in the hill Cumorah, where Joseph and others saw a vision of more records than 10 men could carry. There were books piled upon tables, book upon book. Perhaps in the beginning Joseph never intended his stories of the golden plates to be taken so seriously, but once the masquerade had begun, there was no point at which he could call a halt. Since his own family believed him, with the possible exception of his cynical younger brother William, why should not the world? Martin Harris, who not only accepted but freely elaborated upon the story, was talking openly of financing the publication of the translation and had promised to pay Joseph's debts. His sublime faith in the existence of a record he had never seen augured well for the success of the book, which Joseph was now fully determined to write. But writing in his father's home was impossible because of the persistent inquisitiveness of his family and neighbors, so he decided to return to Harmony, Pennsylvania. Martin Harris agreed to pay his debts and finance the journey, promising to follow him later and help with the translation by acting as secretary. Joseph's going may have been at Emma's insistence, for if one of their neighbors is to be believed, she was miserably unhappy in Manchester. Lorenzo Saunders, then a 16-year-old youth, wrote of her long after, "Joseph's wife was a pretty woman, just as pretty a woman I ever saw. When she came to the Smiths she was disappointed and used to come down to our house and sit down and cry. Said she was deceived and got into a hard place." Perhaps her tears were only for their poverty and the inevitable petty troubles that sprang from living in a house not her own. But Emma was not so credulous that she could refrain from wondering about plates that were too sacred to be seen but not to be stolen. Joseph and Emma moved into a house in Harmony that belonged to Isaac Hale, who was gratified to hear Joseph say that he had given up what he had called glass-looking, and that he had expected to work hard for a living, and was willing to do so. Hale soon discovered, however, that instead of getting down to serious farming, his son-in-law was busy translating characters from a mysterious set of plates he had brought from New York. "I was shown a box," he said, "in which it is said they were contained, which had, to all appearances, been used as a glass box of the common window glass. I was allowed to feel the weight of the box, and they gave to me to understand that the book of the plates was then in the box, into which, however, I was not allowed to look. I inquired of Joseph Smith, Jr., who was to be the first who would be allowed to see the book of plates. He said it was a young child. After this, I became dissatisfied, and informed him that if there were anything else in my house of that description which I could not be allowed to see, he must take it away. If he did not, I was determined to see it. After that, the plates were said to be hid in the woods." Emma was Joseph's first scribe. She never saw the plates, although they often lay on the table wrapped in a small linen tablecloth. Despite her skepticism and bewilderment, Joseph apparently had so frightened her about the consequences of examining them that she dared finger them under the covering only when she moved them to dust the table. "They seemed to be pliable like thick paper," she later said, "and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one does sometimes thumb the edges of a book." Mystified by his ability to translate the characters without even unwrapping the plates, merely by staring into his stone, or stones, for she later said that he used the Urim and Thummim for the first 116 pages and the little dark seer stone for the remainder, she began to take down his dictation. Although the prose had the familiar ring of the King James Bible, the story was nothing like she had ever read or dreamed. "I, Nephi," the book began, "having been born of goodly parents, therefore I was taught somewhat in all the learning of my father, and having seen many afflictions in the course of my days, nevertheless, having been highly favored of the Lord in all my days, yea, having had a great knowledge of the goodness and mysteries of God, therefore I make a record of my proceedings in my days." Joseph explained that the record was a history of the Indians from the earliest times. Like the Bible, it was written by prophets and divided into books. The first prophet, Nephi, was a young Hebrew who had left Jerusalem 600 BC and had sailed to America with his father Lehi and a few followers to avoid the destruction of the city. Lehi actually was an obscure biblical name, but Emma probably knew it better as the name of a river, the Lehi, which ran not far south of Harmony. Like Joseph himself, Nephi had 2 elder brothers, Laman and Lemuel, and 3 younger, Sam, Jacob, and Joseph. Laman and Lemuel were evil-tempered, sinful youths who so incurred the wrath of God that he cursed them and all their descendants with red skin. Nephi and his pious younger brothers begat white children who were favored by the Lord. And thus it happened that the 2 races grew up in America, the Nephites, peace-loving and domestic, and the Lamanites, bloodthirsty and idolatrous. The 2 races fought intermittently for 1,000 years. To defend themselves against the Lamanites, the Nephites finally erected small forts, or places of resort, throwing up banks of earth round about, with timbers built up to the height of a man round about the cities, a frame of pickets built upon the timbers. This kind of description must have sounded familiar to Emma, for western New York was famous for its palisaded Indian forts, one chain running 50 miles from Cattaraugus Creek to the Pennsylvania border. After each battle, the dead were heaped upon the face of the earth, and they were covered with a shallow covering. This, it was to be obvious to everyone who read the book, was the explanation of the Indian mounds, the biggest mounds of all marking the site of the last great battle which had wiped out the white Nephite race. Whatever initial misgivings may have troubled Emma vanquished before the substantial stream of prose that flowed from her husband's lips. She could fathom neither the sources of his ideas nor his marvelously fecund imagination. It is probable that the reality of the golden plates no longer troubled her half so much as Joseph's apparent lack of confidence in her. His refusal to show her the plates became the first serious barrier between them. Never again would she or anyone else share his inner secrets, for Joseph played out his role of translator with such consistency and skill that she could not doubt him. Martin Harris came to Harmony in February 1828, eager to know of the book's progress. When he learned in detail what the plates contained, he was overwhelmed, for the book solved the knotty problem of the origin of the red man, which had been a puzzle ever since 1500. Had Harris been a learned man, he would have known that various writers had designated as the ancestral home of the American Indian not only Jerusalem, but also Iceland, Wales, Rome, Phoenicia, Carthage, Egypt, and China. But he was satisfied to know that they were descendants of the Hebrews, for all the theories then current, the most popular among clergymen in Europe as well as America was that the red men were a remnant of the lost tribes of Israel. America's most distinguished preachers, William Penn, Roger Williams, Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, had all espoused the theory. Edwards had even written a tract pointing out what he thought were likenesses between the Mahikanu Indian tongue and Hebrew. The historian H. Bancroft later wrote, "The theory that the Americans are of Jewish origin has been discussed more minutely and at greater length than any other. Its advocates, or at least those of them who have made original researches, are comparatively few, but the extent of their investigations and the multitude of the parallelisms they adduce in their support of their hypothesis exceed by far anything we have yet encountered." Josiah Priest wrote in 1833 in his American Antiquities, "The opinion that the American Indians are descendants of the lost 10 tribes is now a popular one and generally believed." Fantastic parallels were drawn between Hebraic and Indian customs such as Feast of First Fruits, sacrifices of the firstborn in the flock, cities of refuge, ceremonies of purification, and division into tribes. The Indian language, which actually consisted of countless distinct languages derived from numerous linguistic stocks, was said to be chiefly Hebrew. The Indian belief in the Great Spirit, which originally had been implanted by French and Spanish missionaries, was said to be derived in the direct line from Jewish monotheism. One writer even held that syphilis, the Indians' gift to Europe, was an altered form of biblical leprosy. Joseph Smith had every opportunity to become familiar with such parallelisms. A Jewish rabbi, M. Noah, editor of the New York Enquirer, had summarized them in a long speech that had been republished in full in Joseph's hometown paper on October 11, 1825. If the tribes could be brought together, Noah had concluded, could be made sensible of their origin, could be civilized, and restored to their long-lost brethren, what joy to our people! Joseph unquestionably had access to the Wayne Sentinel, for on August 11, 1826, his father was listed among the delinquent subscribers as owing $5.60. Joseph's familiarity with the theory of Hebraic origin of the Indians seems, however, to have come chiefly from a popular book by Ethan Smith, pastor of a church in Pulteney, Vermont. This book, View of the Hebrews, or the 10 Tribes of Israel in America, was published in 1823, a second edition in 1825. Ethan Smith had managed to collect all the items of 3 generations of specious scholarship and piecemeal observation on this subject, and had added them to Caleb Atwater's accurate depictions of the Ohio mounds and Alexander von Humboldt's glowing account of the architectural ruins of Central America. Ethan Smith's theory of the origin of the Indian mounds was exactly the same as that which formed the heart of the Book of Mormon story. Israel brought into this new continent a considerable degree of civilization, and the better part of them long labored to maintain it, but others fell into the hunting and consequently savage state, whose barbarous hordes invaded their more civilized brethren, and eventually annihilated most of them, and all in these northern regions. It may in fact have been View of the Hebrews that gave Joseph Smith the idea of writing an Indian history in the first place. If the Indians are the tribes of Israel, Ethan Smith said pointedly, some decisive evidence of the fact will ere long be exhibited. And he described in great excitement the discovery of an ancient Hebrew phylactery bound in leather, which had allegedly been unearthed in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He reported also a provocative legend, said to have come from an Indian chief, that the red men had not long since a book which they had for a long time preserved, but having lost the knowledge of reading it, they concluded it would be of no further use to them, and they buried it with an Indian chief. Joseph Smith knew this legend, for he quoted it in his church newspaper in later years as evidence of the historical accuracy of the Book of Mormon, although he was careful to use as a source Josiah Priest's American Antiquities, which had reprinted Ethan Smith's account in 1833, 3 years after the Book of Mormon was published. It may never be proved that Joseph Smith saw View of the Hebrews before writing the Book of Mormon, but the striking parallelisms between the two books hardly leave a case for mere coincidence. Both books opened with frequent references to the destruction of Jerusalem. Both told of inspired prophets among the ancient Americans. Both quoted copiously and almost exclusively from Isaiah, and both delineated the ancient Americans as a highly civilized people. Both held that it was the mission of the American nation in the last days to gather these remnants of the house of Israel and bring them to Christianity, thereby hastening the day of the glorious millennium. View of the Hebrews made much of the legend that the stick of Joseph and the stick of Ephraim, symbolizing the Jews and the lost tribes, would one day be united, and Joseph Smith's first advertising circulars blazoned the Book of Mormon as the stick of Joseph taken from the hand of Ephraim. Ethan Smith had excitingly described copper breastplates taken from the mounds, which had 2 white buckhorn buttons fastened to the outside of each plate, in resemblance of the Urim and Thummim, the ancient magic lots that miraculously blazed on the ephod of the high priest of ancient Israel. In this reference, Joseph elaborated into the fabulous magic spectacles with which he translated the golden plates. View of the Hebrews, however, was only a basic source book for the Book of Mormon. The themes that Joseph borrowed he elaborated with a lavish fancy. This can be seen particularly in the story of Quetzalcoatl, whom Ethan Smith described as the most mysterious being of the whole Mexican mythology, the white-bearded Aztec god who taught his people their prized peaceful arts and for whose return the Aztecs were hoping when Cortez appeared. Ethan Smith described Quetzalcoatl as a type of Christ, but Joseph saw in the legend evidence that Christ himself had come to the New World. The occasional crucifixes found in the mounds gave further weight to this theory, since it was not until years later that scholars proved them to be of French and Spanish in origin. Jesus said, "Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice." These other sheep, Joseph said in his Book of Mormon, were the Lamanites and the Nephites, whom Jesus had visited some time in the early weeks following his final ascension. Christ's coming to America, he wrote, had been preceded by the cataclysmic destruction which annihilated great portions of the population, and by 3 days of darkness, which brought the remainder to their knees in anguished repentance. The dramatic appearance of Jesus then made such an impact on the devastated people that the red and white tribes accepted his gospel and lived together as brothers for several generations before Satan's wiles began again to split them asunder. Thus, the view of Hebrews was just bad scholarship. The Book of Mormon was highly original and imaginative fiction. 35 years after the Book of Mormon was published, an old antiquarian in Ohio who had spent years in trying to prove that the Indians were descended from the Hebrews pretended to have discovered in a mound several stone plates with the Ten Commandments inscribed in Hebrew. After his death, investigators discovered that he had laboriously chipped the stone himself, copying the characters from a Hebrew Bible which he had neglected to destroy. Between this pathetic petty deception and the Book of Mormon lies the difference between a painfully cramped imagination and an audacious and original mind. Joseph Smith took the whole Western Hemisphere as the setting for his book and 1,000 years of history for his plot. Never having written a line of fiction, he laid out for himself a task that would have given the most experienced novelist pause. But possibly because of this very inexperience, he plunged into the story. Sagacious enough to realize that he could not possibly write a history of the lost 10 tribes, he chose instead to describe only the peregrinations of 2 Hebrew families, headed by Lehi and Ishmael, who became the founders of the American race. He began the book by focusing on a single hero, Nephi, who, like himself, was peculiarly gifted of the Lord. This device launched him smoothly into his narrative and saved him from having bitten off more than he could chew.